Hello, my name is James Gallagher, and this video is an introduction to Meterpreter, which is a part of the Metasploit framework. This video will go over some basics of Meterpreter, but assumes that you have some knowledge of the Metasploit framework already. So what is Meterpreter? Meterpreter is a payload which can be delivered to a remote victim so that an attacker can interact with that victim remotely using the Metasploit framework. As you can see here from Offensive Security's website, there are some great features with Meterpreter. It's stealthy, resides completely in memory, and uses encrypted communications. Very powerful tool for interacting with your remote victim. Let me introduce to you my lab environment that I'll be using for this demonstration. First, I have a terminal window here with two tabs, each of which are SSH'd into a remote Kali box, which I have in Amazon AWS. This right tab shows the operating system level of Kali, and you can see we have a .194 address here. The left tab is already set up with Metasploit opened, and this will be our attack box for this demonstration. In addition, I have a Windows box which is in Amazon AWS. It has a .20 IP address, and it's a Windows Server 2008 box. The way we're going to do this demonstration is I'm going to run a module, the PSExec PowerShell module, that assumes that you already have some credentials on your remote host. So, for instance, you may have performed a phishing attack and you've gotten some credentials which you're going to use on a victim host, or maybe you've cracked some hashes, something of that nature, and now you want to use these credentials which you have to exploit a remote host. The module, like I said, is the PowerShell PSExec module. You can pull up this module yourself using the use exploit windows smb psexec_psh command. And once we do show options on this module, you can see the different options that I already have set. So I've set the remote host to be our Windows box. I have the credentials here, the SMB pass, and the username is administrator. So these are the credentials we're going to use to compromise the remote host. You can, of course, run commands like set rhost for your remote host, set rhost, and then the IP address. Same thing with SMB pass, set SMB user. I've also set up my module to use a payload of Meterpreter, and the way I've done that is by running the following commands: set payload, Windows 64, because it's a 64-bit victim, Meterpreter, and reverse TCP. For the payload, I've also done a set lhost and used the local Kali Linux IP address that you can see here from the if config output for that. So everything's ready to go with this module, so we should be able to just run this module, and using those credentials, we're going to authenticate to our victim and see if we can get a Metasploit Meterpreter session on our remote victim. I'll just type run and see what happens. Great, so now we have a Meterpreter session on our remote victim. It has a session number of 10, you can see here, session 10. And now we're looking at a Meterpreter shell. So the Meterpreter shell allows you to run commands that are specific to Meterpreter that will interact with the remote victim. The first one I usually like to run when I get a Meterpreter shell is just sysinfo. Take a look at what my victim looks like. It's a Windows Server 2008 R2 box, of course 64-bit. That just gives me some basic information. Also interesting is to run the get PID command. We can see that our Meterpreter session is running on PID 1324. So now I can go over to my victim and we can actually see that PowerShell is running on a PID of 1324. So that's interesting from a defender's perspective. If you see a mysterious PowerShell running on your server, you might want to check it out, right? So it might be a Meterpreter session. So back to our Meterpreter session, we can get a list of all Meterpreter commands by running the help command. Some great stuff here. We have webcam commands. We can even take a snapshot of a remote webcam. All kinds of great stuff you can look through here just to kind of go into all the different techniques. But we're only going to cover some of those in this video, and you can check out the rest yourself. I'm going to show you the most important ones and the most useful ones that you may use on an engagement. Before we do that, though, I want to show you how to background your Meterpreter shell and then get back into it if you need to. So if we were to type quit, we would just completely kill our Meterpreter session. But if we type background, we can actually put it into the background and now resume our regular usage of Metasploit and call other modules, etc. And that session will just still be there. We can run sessions and see it. There it is. Session 10 is still there, backgrounded. If you run sessions-h, you can see all the different ways to manipulate sessions. The most important would be -K to kill it, or -K to kill all sessions, useful for cleanup during a penetration test or security assessment. Also, what we're going to do in this particular case is just a sessions-I to go back to interact with the session that we got earlier. So it's a session 10, and now we're back on our Meterpreter shell. So now that we've seen how to background our Meterpreter shell and then get back into it, now we'll look at some of the other commands useful through Meterpreter. First off, we're going to look at how to enumerate network information on remote hosts. This can be very important if you want to perform a pivot attack, etc. We can run an ipconfig command, or even if it's a Windows box, we can still run ifconfig. Either one will work within Meterpreter. They both do the same thing, which is show you the remote network interfaces. Now, some of these commands resemble operating system commands, but are not true operating system commands. They're Meterpreter commands, right, that are calling an operating system command on the remote host. For instance, we can run ARP, and we can see the ARP cache. We can run route and see the Windows routing table for our victim, and netstat, of course, to look at active connections. And like I said, though these commands resemble operating system commands, they're not true operating system commands. If you want to run true operating system commands, you would need to drop to a shell. You can type shell, and now we have a true Windows command prompt. We can run things like dir and take a look at what's on our remote drive, etc. If we want to exit our Windows shell, we just type exit and it brings us back to Meterpreter. So very useful if you have some sort of custom attack or post-exploitation that you want to perform. Now, let's talk about some other useful techniques for using Meterpreter. For instance, we can do a get UID and see who we're running as, what account. We're running as system. So in this case, we have full access to the remote system. In some cases, you may not have such access. You might want to do things like get system or get privs, things like that, to try to escalate your privileges on the remote victim. So those can be useful commands. Also useful is the PS command. We can take a look at remote processes that are running. We can even use the migrate command, which would allow us to migrate to a different process. This video doesn't go into detail on the migrate command, but it's something very useful in certain types of exploitation scenarios. My favorite command, though, is the screenshot command. You can use this command to take a remote screenshot of our victim. You can see it was saved to the local Kali hard drive. We'll go back to this other tab here and take a look. You can see that it saved this JPEG. In order to open that JPEG, since I'm SSH to it, I decided to just set up a little web server on my remote Kali box. So here's that JPEG. I can just open it through the web server that I have. Great, so we have a remote screenshot of our victim. In this case, it's just a Control-Delete screen because no one's logged in locally at the console. Even though we do have a remote desktop session that's unlocked, it's not unlocked at the console. So you'll get that in some cases depending on the scenario of your victim host. Screenshot command is great. Also, the #dump command. The #dump command, well, let's see, we'll get that into our Meterpreter, not through bash. So we're going to run #dump, and #dump shows us different hashes that can, or NTLM hashes that we can enumerate from the remote host. In this case, we got a new hash that we didn't have before, which is for a new account, the John Doe account that I set up. So that's great to have. We might be able to use that for other types of attacks, maybe against John Doe's machine, etc. So very useful command, #dump. What about interacting with the remote file system? So I like to run show mount just to see what we have on the remote file system. We have a C drive, right? And now we can perform different types of commands to interact with the remote file system. We can do things like ls, and once again, you're familiar with ls being a Linux command, but because Meterpreter uses similar syntax to Linux, we can still run ls even though it's a Windows host, right? So I can do ls : and list the remote root of the remote drive, you can see there's a folder here of interest called secret stuff. So we can actually get into that folder, do something like cd, C:, and we have to escape our backslash. So we need to always use 2 backslashes, right? And now we've changed to that directory. We can check it with pwd. And yes, we've changed directory into the secret stuff folder. So now let's perform ls again. Aha, an interesting file in our secret stuff folder, right? Called super secret file. So there are different things we can do to interact with this file. We can actually use a cat command, kind of like you would do in Linux, only we can do Meterpreter supports cat. So we can say cat super secret file.txt. Aha, now we've got an SSH password that we're able to find through that text file. So you can see how this would be useful for post-exploitation on a remote victim. We can also download that file if we just want to bring it over here to our Kali Linux instead of only looking at it remotely. We can do download, and now it's brought that file to the local operating system, the local drive here for our Kali Linux. I'm going to do an ls command back on this other tab, and now we have the super secret file. Now we can interact with that file at the operating system level on our Kali box. Back to our Metasploit Meterpreter session tab though here. What else can we do with a remote file system? Well, we can also upload files. So we can actually take and run an upload command to send some sort of maybe new payload or whatever the custom use might be. So I have a file here called evil.exe that I want to send up to the remote host. So what we're going to do is upload evil.exe, and then C:, we'll have to escape the backslash Windows System 32. And now we've uploaded that evil executable file to our remote victim. So now I'm going to go over here to our remote desktop session, see if we can see that file, and there it is. So that file has now been uploaded to our victim. Very useful stuff you can see here through the Meterpreter shell. But the last thing I wanted to show you is how to run another module against an existing Meterpreter shell. So I'm going to background this Meterpreter, and you can see through sessions that it's still there, right? We have active session of 10, but now I'm actually going to call a different Metasploit module. I'm going to do the enum applications. This is a module that's basically used to enumerate installed applications on a remote victim. So we can do like show options for this one and see that it asks for a session number. In this case, our active session is 10. So we're going to tell this module to interact with session 10. So we'll do set session 10, and you can see that now it's set as 10, and we're just going to run that module. Great, so we were now able to enumerate applications that are installed on our remote host. And of interest in particular is the PuTTY application that's installed on a remote host. We might be able to use that for something like finding some keys, SSH keys that are on the remote victim, other types of post-exploitation that could take place using this information. So now you know not only how to background and resume your Metasploit Meterpreter session and how to run various Meterpreter commands, but you also know how to allow other Metasploit modules to interact with an existing backgrounded session. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot about how Meterpreter works.